Howdy everybody, Mr. Bob, your neighborhood naturalist from the North Carolina Zoo. Thank you very kindly for inviting me to come back and spend a little bit of time with you today. Something I want to talk about ever so briefly is something I call plant diversity. Plant diversity means the number of plants that can occupy a given space. It's not just at one time, but it's over time too, because they do change as things go. Generally speaking, when we talk about any community, but specifically plants, things get healthier when there's more than one type of plant. We call it a diverse culture when we have a bunch of different kinds of plants. We call it monoculture when we only have one. We'll look at my yard here as an example. I have lots of these, we'll call them wildflowers. You might call them weeds because they're flowers that come up where I didn't plant them and I didn't necessarily intend them to grow. So what happens is there are a whole bunch of different things. For years I have maintained that neatly mown weeds look an awful lot like a lawn. You decide for yourselves. Anyhow, I have a lot of different types of plants. There are violets, there's clover, there are buttercups. I'm looking right now over that way. There's some that are called lyre leaf sage, bunches of different plants. Different plants and having lots of different plants are good for a lot of reasons. Let me show you an example. Down here on the table, I have two representations of my backyard. Now the Q-tips in each one of these yards, we'll call it, are meant to represent a different kind of plant. So we have yellow ones, we have black ones, red ones, white ones, green ones. So there are different types of plants in this particular yard. Over here, it's all one type of plant. That means this is a very diverse culture and this is a monoculture. And just for the sake of the song and for the sake of the yard, we're going to call these native plants. So here we have the native diverse plant culture. Over here, we'll call these a monoculture. You can decide for yourself whether these are going to be natives or plants that were planted. In this particular instance, in the green bowl, one of the things you'll notice is that you have all these different types of plants. They're all uniquely suited for different conditions. Each year, different grasses come up at different times, and different plants come up at different times. Early in the spring, we get one called chickweed, and the chickweed typically doesn't survive when it gets really hot and dry. So when the chickweed starts to go away, it gets hot, it dies out. There's still other grasses here. The other thing that's really cool about this is that that makes room for something else to come in. So the green ones could expand, somebody else could do that as well. That's a really good thing that happens. It's a cyclic progression of plants that are coming up in the yard. It's also very important because no matter what, no matter when, there's always some degree of cover for the soil. The dirt itself, and I'm using those interchangeably even though they're not necessarily interchangeable, but the soil here is very susceptible to being blown by the wind and being washed away by the rain. So that's why we want to keep plants here all the time. In this particular example, in the lighter colored bowl, we have a monoculture. If it was chickweed and all I had growing in my yard was chickweed, as soon as the weather started to get hot, as soon as it got into the summer, the chickweed starts to die off. And when that happens, I start to lose all the ground cover. There's nothing that's going to break up the energy of the rain, that's going to stop the wind from blowing this away. So once we lose the ground cover, this soil, any minerals, any nutrients, any of this stuff is going to be blown by the wind, washed by the rain. It can run off and end up in the creek that's across the street, but it means the ground is no longer protected. And that's what we don't want to happen. So, monoculture, probably not the best way to run your yard. Diverse culture, pretty good. Monoculture, especially if it's non-native, probably may not handle the heat and the other conditions that happen here in Asheboro. Native plants, excellent choice. So as you see, it's really a pretty good idea to have a lot of different kinds of plants growing in a particular area. it's an even better idea to make sure that all of those different kinds of plants are native plants. When the early Americans got here and they started moving west across the United States and they got to the states we call the Plain States, the prairies, they would see these wonderful waves and waves and waves of beautiful green grass growing as far as the eye could see. And this was in places like North Texas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Kansas, and out that way. Settlers looked at that grass and they thought, wow, that must be great soil, that must grow great crops. So they went and they took up all the native grasses and they planted corn and wheat. The native grasses were really, really well adapted to live there. They could live in soil that didn't have a lot of nutrients in it. They could live in very dry conditions because there wasn't an awful lot of rain. Corn and wheat, not so good at living under those conditions. So once the natural plants were gone off the ground, it created a lot of dust and dirt that would blow in the wind. If you want to do a little research on it, it's called the Dust Bowl, and there's a wonderful book that's written by a guy named Tim Egan called The Worst Hard Time. It focuses mostly on the people of the time, but it talks about what happened when it got really dry and people didn't have the resources to be able to water their crops. They died. And sometimes you would have a huge wind come through. It could pick up enough dust and dirt to bury a car in about an hour. It was amazing, and it was very, very harsh. It happened to happen at a time in the United States when we were under a depression as well. So for the most part, it just kept piling circumstances up. People lived a very difficult life under the Dust Bowl. So our lesson today, diverse native plants, good healthy habitat. Monoculture non-native plants, maybe not quite so good. Thanks for having me in today. I'm Mr. Bob, your neighborhood naturalist, and I'll be back next time.